Thank you, Mr. President. I think that Americans following what's happening over the last 48 hours recognize that we're seeing a great deal of chaos and turmoil around the country. And it's having a harmful impact across communities, across my state of Maryland, across the country. On Monday night, the Trump administration issued an order to all federal agencies to freeze the disbursement of federal funds until there was a review period with the threat that much of those funds would be withheld. And what that did was trigger a lot of understandable panic across the country. In my office, we heard from firefighters in many different parts of our state. These are firefighters who receive grants to help purchase equipment that they need to run into burning buildings to help save people in emergency circumstances and to hire more staff. We heard from people who work in Head Start programs to try to make sure that kids get an early help and lift up in life. We heard from folks in law enforcement, including people who are involved in preventing human trafficking and sex trafficking of minors. We heard from small businesses worried about their grants. We heard from people in all different walks of life and different communities who were very worried that the important federal initiatives that they rely on to help provide support for people in their communities were being turned off. And I want to make something crystal clear. This was avoidable. This did not happen by accident. I did see comments by the president's deputy policy director, Steve Miller, saying, this was a very clear directive, and there's been a lot of fake news about it. Mr. President, I would just urge people to take a look at that directive. It's extremely broad, and it's very ambiguous, and it was very foreseeable that federal agencies would essentially put an immediate halt to funds going to everybody from firefighters to those who are fighting sex trafficking. So how did this happen? It happened because this is an administration, this Trump administration, that believes that it has the power to cherry pick the law, to decide what parts of laws that have been duly enacted by this Congress they like and want to implement, and which ones they want to reject. That is an unconstitutional power grab, pure and simple. Because under Article 1, the Congress has the power of the purse. And when we pass a law, including an appropriations bill, to provide funding for important national and local priorities, and that's signed into law, that becomes the law of the land. And presidents can't treat that like it's an a la carte menu. They can't say, well, I'm going to implement this priority because I like that one, and I'm going to reject this provision in the law because I don't like it. That's not how it works. The framers created checks and balances in our system to prevent presidents from acting like kings and ignoring laws that they don't like and only implementing the ones that they do. This all came to a head many, many decades ago when President Nixon exercised what was called the line item veto. So Congress passes legislation, the product of back and forth and negotiation and compromise, signed by the President of the United States. That makes it law. That's the law of the land. So what President Nixon said was, well, I'm going to sign this, but there's certain provisions here that I don't like. I don't want to be spending any money on Head Start for example, or I don't want to spend money on law enforcement and police, for example. And so I'm going to veto those provisions, but I'm going to accept the rest of the law, even though Congress passed all of it in totality. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. Presidents are not kings. They don't have the power to selectively implement parts of the law they like and reject the others. And then Congress passed what's known as the Impoundment Control Act. This is legislation that says presidents cannot impound. In other words, they can't withdraw or put aside funds that have been duly enacted by Congress just because they don't like the purposes for which Congress passed those provisions. But this president and this administration believes that the Impoundment Control Act doesn't apply to them. And we don't have to guess at this question. All we have to do is look at the testimony of somebody called Russ Vought. So who is Russ Vought? Russ Vought is President Trump's nominee to head the Office of Management and Budget. What's the Office of Management and Budget? It's an office within the White House that directs the budget control over all the other federal agencies. They're like the central command center for all the other agencies, whether it's Health and Human Services or EPA, whatever federal agency it is, they all feed their budget requests up to the Office of Management and Budget in the Executive Office of the President. And Russ Vought was nominated to head that position. In fact, tomorrow in the Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, we'll have a vote on Russ Vought. We had his hearing a little while ago. And at that hearing, I asked him point blank, as did Senator Murray, whether he and the Trump administration would comply with the Impoundment Control Act. And you have to look at the videotape. He refused to confirm that he would apply the law. He wouldn't say yes. In fact, what he said was that President Trump has issues with the Impoundment Control Act, doesn't think it's constitutional. So he refused to commit to applying the law here. He said that they may want to change that. So the obvious answer is, okay, President Trump, if you want to change the Impoundment Control Act, let's seek an amendment to it. It'll go through the congressional process, and you can try to amend the law. But for now, the law is as it's written, and you can't ignore it. And yet, Russ Vought said, we refuse to commit to comply with this thing. And we'd actually seen this movie before in the first Trump administration because Russ Vought was in charge of OMB for part of that first Trump term. And people may recall that we had quite a discussion when President Trump in his first term wanted to withhold military assistance from Ukraine. Even though Congress, the House and the Senate had passed that into law and it had been signed into law. But President Trump just decided he didn't want to implement that policy, and so they withheld funds. I wrote to the GAO, that's Congress's watchdog, and I asked them a very simple question. I asked them whether this withholding of military assistance to Ukraine constituted an illegal withholding. In other words, could President Trump hold onto and not disperse those funds that have been enacted by Congress to help the people of Ukraine? And GAO looked into it, and they sent me back a letter, crystal clear, that the Trump administration had violated the Impoundment Control Act. And Russ Vought, as the head of OMB at the time, violated the Impoundment Control Act. So now we are here today. Russ Vought is up again, nominated to be in charge of OMB. And at the hearing the other day, as I said, he refused to commit to complying with the Impoundment Control Act. And that's what we're seeing here, Mr. President, in this freeze on the funds and the claim that they can look at these and decide, Congress may have passed this, may have been signed into law, but we're not going to disperse them because we disagree with the purposes. You can't do that. Now, the president is going to submit the president's budget to Congress, and we will have an opportunity to look at his proposals, and we will act on it. But the president can't take a law that's already been put into effect and decide, I'm only going to help the people I want and not the other people that I don't want to help. And the real concern, just 10 days into this administration, is this is part and parcel of a much larger effort and strategy. And I can tell you for certain, this is not about making the federal government more efficient. If my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to sit down and seriously find ways to make the federal government more efficient, I'm all in. But that's not what this DOGE committee headed by Elon Musk is all about. At least none of the early indications suggest that that's what it's about. And the reason we know that is because one of the main initiatives being taken on by this new administration is something called Schedule F. Now, Schedule F, that's sort of innocuous sounding thing. What could that mean? Schedule F is a concerted effort to throw out the merit-based civil service structure that we have in this country, the merit-based system where people are hired based on their qualifications and their experience and their knowledge, and replace it with a political cronyism-based system. And I want to pause here for a moment just to make sure everybody understands the way things work now. Obviously, when you have a new president elected, the president can bring in lots of new people. We're debating right now advice and consent on some cabinet officials. The president also can hire the top echelon of people in agencies across the federal government. In fact, there are about 4,000 political appointees today, people that the president puts into these positions. That's fine. But what Schedule F would do, and what President Trump and his nominee to be head of OMB want to do, is to take about 50 to 60,000 additional federal positions and convert them from merit-based systems to political cronyism systems. So instead of being hired on the merits, instead of being hired based on your qualifications and your experience and what you know, they want you to be hired based on who you know, a political test. And you can see, Mr. President, if you place about 50 to 60,000 political cronies across the federal government in these positions, you can get them to overlook the law, like the Impoundment Control Act. You can get them to overlook the Constitution. And I dare say the American people don't want political hacks to be the people who are doing food safety inspections or responsible for the air traffic control system, or really any other part of our government where we rely on experience and qualifications, not a political test. So this is a really important moment because the Trump administration is claiming this power not only to violate the Impoundment Control Act and withhold funds from whatever they don't like and reward those who do, but they want to create a whole structure within the federal government to replace these merit-based civil servants with political cronies. And what's another thing you would do if you were president to try to make sure you knocked down all the provisions we have for accountability. Hey, you would fire all the inspector generals. So what are inspector generals? They're people in various federal departments whose job it is to root out fraud, waste, and abuse. Their job is to make sure that people in these agencies don't ignore the law, don't waste taxpayer money. And yet, President Trump fired the inspector generals in these agencies. In other words, he fired the people who were supposed to provide accountability to protect the public against waste, fraud, and abuse. So don't tell me you're for more government efficiency when you're firing the people whose job it is to keep a lookout for fraud, waste, and abuse. What's really happening is you're firing the people who would be responsible for calling out any wrongdoing by these 60,000 additional political cronies that the president wants to put in place in these departments to do his bidding. I would hope colleagues on both sides of the aisle would see that this is really fraught with danger. Because when you open the door to this kind of political cronyism, you also open the door to corruption. And when you get rid of the inspector generals, that means more people think that they can get away with that kind of corruption. Now, Schedule F is not the only ongoing effort apparently the president has to get rid of merit-based federal employees. They just sent out this note within the last couple days offering, quote, early retirement to federal employees. I think the idea is that if you agree to retire in the next couple weeks, that you can continue to work through, you can continue to get your paycheck through September or something without working. I have no idea if that's even legal. What we do know is the memo that was sent out to these federal employees was remarkably similar to something that Elon Musk sent out to employees in his company at one point. In fact, the title of the memo, A Fork in the Road, was exactly what was on Elon Musk's memo. And in fact, apparently Elon Musk is bringing in some computer systems and other things to the executive office buildings over there at the White House. I would caution federal employees that we don't even know if this is legal, and don't count on you getting the benefit of whatever bargain the president's apparently promising you, because what this really is an effort just to clear out more people from the merit-based system to create vacancies to bring in political cronies. That's what this is all about. You implement a hiring freeze, which is what they've done. Then you get current federal employees to retire early through something that could end up being a scam, I don't know. And then you implement Schedule F and bring in 50 to 60,000 people. So this is a really important and consequential moment for all of us who care about a merit-based civil service. And by the way, you know, we've had a merit-based system since the late 1800s. We adopted this merit-based system after President James Garfield was assassinated by a disappointed job seeker, someone who had worked on his campaign and didn't get a job. And at that point, the American people said, this spoil system where people are getting jobs just based on who they know, not what they know, this isn't delivering quality services for the American people. And so they passed the Pendleton Act. What's happening now is a direct attack on that merit-based civil service. So what's the ultimate goal here? The ultimate goal is for President Trump to put in place these political loyalists who will do his bidding. So bidding for who? Now, in the last campaign, I think many people who supported candidate Trump believed that he was there to look out for working people, to look out for the forgotten Americans. That was sort of what he said on the campaign. But on Inauguration Day, just down the hall here a little bit, I think we got a better idea of exactly who it was and who it is that President Trump is looking out for. Because he gave a speech talking about the new golden age for America. And the people who had the best seats in the House, better than his cabinet nominees, were the billionaire tech titans. Elon Musk and others, they were right there, right behind the president. We also know that one of the president's major goals is to put in place another big tax cut. Tax cut for who? A tax cut for the very wealthiest people in the country who will get a disproportionate share of any proposed tax cuts. We can expect to see that in round two because we saw that in Trump administration round one. And big tax breaks for corporations who promised they would use the proceeds, by the way, to expand plant and equipment, to raise wages of their employees. That's not what happened. They used the extra money for stock buybacks that benefited very wealthy stockholders disproportionately. And the CEOs got bonuses. We didn't see wages for other employees. So it's not just that the tax plan will benefit the very wealthy, it's that it will do that at the expense of working Americans. I just take a peek at some of the proposals that are being put forward in the House Budget Committee by Republican leaders in that committee. They're coming after very important programs that benefit the American people, whether in health care or nutrition. We'll have to see when it finally comes out of there, but we know that most of the cuts they're proposing are going to be harmful to working Americans, to the people that candidate Trump claimed he wanted to help. So this is a moment where everybody needs to focus very clearly on what their expectations were, because it's shaping up to be a great betrayal. It's shaping up to be a situation where this new administration wants to get rid of merit-based civil servants, bring in a lot of political cronies, and then implement these huge tax cuts for very wealthy Americans and the biggest corporations at the expense of everybody else in America. And that is not, I don't think that's what the people bargained for in this last election. So I come to the floor today because we're seeing the Trump administration put in place some of these pieces that would be necessary to achieving these big tax breaks and benefits to the very wealthy. Whenever a president decides that he gets to cherry pick the law and just provide resources to his political benefactors and ignore the rest of the law, that's a big danger signal. When the nominee to be the head of OMB refuses to commit to follow the law, that's a big danger signal. So I would just ask all of our colleagues to do our jobs as members of Congress in the Article I branch and make sure that we don't see this flagrant attack on the Constitution be successful. And Mr. President, with that, I will yield the floor.